Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the escalating tension during the Cold War. Specifically, we're going to talk about the loss of China and the Soviet bomb, the Soviet atomic weapon. And so Truman is still president, and really kind of wants to focus domestically on his fair deal, trying to, promote more New Deal type policies. And, kind of that's what he wants his focus to be. But by the time we get to like 1950, that's just not feasible anymore. His main attention has to become foreign policy and dealing with the effects of the Cold War. Keep in mind when we're talking about these issues in China and the Soviet bomb, it's in a world that really believes in domino theory, that if one country falls to communism, its neighbors are susceptible to falling to communism. That's going to be applicable later. And the idea to stop that is through containment. And so, Kennan's idea of containment, it's political, it's economic, but it's also involving the military. And so, how do we stop the spread of communism? Well, all through all three of those avenues. So, like I said, Truman's second term here is really going to be dominated by foreign policy and deep foreign policy, dealing with foreign nations, and he's going to have to shift his focus away from the fair deal. Americans are concerned about communism. Communism is on the rise globally. We are definitely afraid of communist infiltration in the United States. It's not a real threat in the United States. Only about 1% of Americans are actually communists. And keep in mind, that's a constitutionally protected right. If you want to be a communist in the United States, that's a part of your constitutional right to freedom of speech, freedom of association. You have those rights, but people still, just because you have the right, they're still afraid of it. And that fear is not, looking back with hindsight, it's not necessarily justifiable, but it does make logical sense for the people that are living back then. Communism is on the rise globally, and the Comintern that was created in the 1920s, the Communist International, has promised that it is going to infiltrate capitalist democracies, and it's going to infiltrate them through labor unions to overthrow these capitalist democracies. And so, in retrospect, we know that we don't really need to be afraid of this infiltration, but people that are living in that time period, it makes sense why they're concerned. And so Truman, for political reasons, really needs to come out strong against communism. That's why we have the Truman Doctrine, which we've talked about in previous lectures, just that will support free peoples against the rise of armed minorities. Essentially, will support democracies over communist uprisings. And so Truman has to look strong when it comes to resisting communism. And so he has to resist it at home. That's part of the reason why in the last lecture we talked about his weakening of the unions, and he has to look strong facing communists abroad. And so Truman Doctrine, what he did in Greece and Turkey, which we talked about in previous lectures with providing aid to resist communists, and later with China and dealing with the Soviets and bomb. So in his inaugural address, Truman lays out essentially a four-part plan to combat the communists and their rise around the world. That plan is going to involve using the UN to try and put international pressures on communist countries and to use the UN to support democracies. That can be difficult because the UN it's a diplomatic body, and there's rules for how resolutions get passed, and they have to go through the Security Council. And the Russians, the Soviets, have veto power there. They're not going to allow the UN to do too much to stop the rise of communism. What we will see, and we'll talk about this a little bit later with Korea. We will see that through some like backroom like conniving and intrigue, we are able to use the UN as a tool to stop communism, sometimes even when the Russians have veto power. We'll talk about that in future lectures. He also wants to use the Marshall Plan. Just as a reminder, we talked about the Marshall Plan in previous lectures. The Marshall Plan is an economic stimulus package to Europe. And so, we're spending billions of dollars to stimulate the European economy. Remember, the greatest way to combat the rise of communism and socialism is a strong middle class. If the economy is good, the middle class doesn't want to have their stuff taken away and redistributed to other people. Generally speaking, if you're in the middle class, you made sacrifices to get there. You spent the money on an education, you saved money instead of, just spending it every time you got it. You acquired wealth over, years and years of hard work, and you don't want to see that redistributed. And so, part of the way that we are trying to combat communism and socialism is by creating that strong middle class that will really resist, the communist influence and the socialist influence. And so the Marshall Plan, this is an extremely effective tool because the European economies are wrecked after World War II. Okay. The third thing is NATO. We talked about NATO in a previous lecture as well. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is the largest military defensive alliance in the world. If you attack one nation, you attack all. And so NATO is trying to build a firewall, particularly in Europe, to stop the spread of communism into Europe any more than necessary. Essentially, if the Soviets try to spread into any of these NATO nations, that will, trigger this alliance, which means that the Soviets would have to fight essentially all the major military powers and economic powers in the world at the time. And so that is a very serious deterrent. And then we have the next point, which has probably the least creative name in the history of all names. And it's essentially a worldwide Marshall Plan. So same thing, we're going to spur economies all around the world because the better their economies do, the less likely they are to become communist or socialist. And so the name for that is Point 4, because it's, the fourth point. So global Marshall Plan, again, spur the economy. So that's Truman's plan for fighting, communism around the world. Not a bad plan. But then things start to really go south, and they go south in China. And so this is China, it's going to shock the world. So, it really is going to come as a surprise when China falls to communism. It comes as a surprise because America has been supporting Chiang Kai-shek, who's the leader of the nationalist government there. They were our allies during World War II. And, it's really looked upon as a State Department failure to support Chiang Kai-shek and to make everybody aware that the communists are a serious threat. Now, the State Department really doesn't fail here. The State Department kind of, has been making these warnings. But, because China falling to communism is such a big deal, it's a huge country. It's got an extremely large population. It's got all kinds of natural resources and is, although it's not the economic powerhouse it is today, everybody knows it has the potential to be that. So this is a huge blow to capitalism and, democracy. And so people are looking for a scapegoat, and it's going to be the State Department. And that will later further lead to accusations and conspiracy theories at the State Department about communist sympathizers infiltrating the State Department. And we'll talk about that more in our lecture on McCarthyism that will hopefully be out in the next few days. So China, we talked about this in previous lectures. China has been fighting a civil war even before World War II broke out. So it's been Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists who America supports versus Mao Zedong, or just Chairman Mao. He's not chairman yet, but Mao, who is leading a communist revolution. And so when Japan invades China, the nationalists and the communists essentially call a truce, and they both agree to fight the Japanese invasion off together, independently, but together. Well, Mao doesn't do that. He's actually losing the civil war to Shek, at least initially. It's not gangbusters. And so Mao uses World War II as an opportunity. And so when the two sides decide to essentially call a truce, Chiang Kai-shek is actually in charge of China. He's then absolutely obligated to fight the Japanese, and the Japanese are just better trained, better equipped, and it's a really brutal fight. Mao doesn't help. He retreats back into the mountains and re-recruits more followers and is going to train them, and he's going to spend his time recruiting more and more communists. He's going to re-equip, he's going to resupply. And so at the end of World War II, what's going to happen is Chiang Kai-shek is he's just worn out. The nationalists are worn out. The fighting has been very, very tough. The Chinese aren't as well equipped as the Japanese. They aren't as well trained, but they have more people. And so the nationalists have essentially just been rounding up the peasants and throwing the peasants at the better trained, better equipped Japanese. And so, it's essentially this war of attrition here, and the peasants are paying the price. And so when the fighting is over, the nationalists are worn out, and there's a large amount of resentment among the peasants because they feel like they bore the brunt. And Mao takes advantage of that. He essentially says, look, they're taking advantage of you, the poor people. They threw you into this meat grinder of a war. And so for the benefit of the rich aristocracy that own all the land that you've been working, you'll support us, the communists. And what we'll do is we'll take that land from those rich landowners, we'll redistribute it out to you, and you can finally own your own plot of land. And that's really appealing to these, to all these peasants. Now, keep in mind, when Mao takes over, he's going to purge China, and he's going to kill, estimates are between 60 and 100 million people. It's just awful. But the peasants don't know that. And so there's this really strong appeal to communism. And so the communists come out absolutely fresh and ready to fight. And Chiang Kai-shek is not prepared for that. And so the two sides are fighting. Shek is barely holding on. The State Department now is warning the government, even though the government's not really willing to listen, that Chiang Kai-shek is a bad dude. Like, he's been mistreating the peasants. He's corrupt, and the people are not supporting him. And so, when we have these two leaders, everybody is underestimating Mao, and everybody thinks that because Chiang Kai-shek has the support of the United States and access to the American aid, that Shek should be able to hang on. But Mao just overcame that with a grassroots effort. He's sending in his supporters with his little red book that is essentially going to go into these towns and is going to start to try and educate peasants, reading to them out of his little red book, essentially explaining why the transfer to communism benefits these peasants, and the peasants are going to buy it. they're going to buy into it. They're going to support Mao, and that's going to lead to the overthrow of Shek's government. And so, everybody thought the nationalists would organize and control China after the war. They'd be able to easily defeat Mao, but that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because Shek doesn't have the support of the people anymore. So, despite all the help from the United States, the communists actually do take over, because the peasants are tired of the aristocracy and the land ownership of a few, and the promise of land redistribution is extremely appealing. And so the communists will be able to successfully push push Shanghai Shek out of power. The nationalist government will flee to the Chinese island of Formosa, where they will set up their own government there. They will rename the island of Formosa Taiwan. And establish their own government there. Well, the Chinese government at the time is not powerful enough to, extricate the nationalists from Taiwan. America very quickly, because this is a PR nightmare for the United States, will recognize Taiwan and come into step to defend Taiwan. And so China's not in a place to take it back. This is still a serious point of contention in the world today. China does not, even today, recognize Taiwan as a legitimate sovereign country. They believe it's Chinese Formosa. And so, America, backs Taiwan, but we also have to have a relationship with China because of trade. And so, it's this delicate dance that we do, we protect Taiwan, and we provide them with weapons, and we almost always have a fleet of ships out in that area to protect them. But we also are very careful with the way that we speak about Taiwan. As a matter of fact, right now we're going through the COVID pandemic. The World Health Organization, which is run by the UN, the other day refused to say the word Taiwan in public. They were asked a question about how Taiwan is handling the COVID pandemic, and the WHO guy pretended he didn't even hear the word, because he knows if he says Taiwan, China might pull funding from the WHO, even if they don't pull funding, there'd be a backlash against WHO from China, and they didn't want that. And so, that's how contentious this is. China you just can't say the word Taiwan without upsetting China. And so, nationalists are now in Taiwan, and the Chinese are taking over. It's at this point, when the Chinese take over, that we really start to see Mao's purges. And again, the idea is, it's communism. It's everybody's equal. And so, the people that were landowners, they are going to be rounded up and killed because, they were the greedy, capitalists that subjugated the poor. The teachers, the middle class will be rounded up as well. Anybody that challenges Mao's authority, because at the end of the day, to force equality of outcome, right, not equality of opportunity, right, which is everybody has a fair shot to work hard and study and then make as much money as their ability allows. That's equality of opportunity. Equality of outcome is everybody gets everything equally. And so, to be able to do that, you have to have a military state, because if, the farmer A is growing, potatoes, and the government owns those potatoes, and they take them all, and each person in the village gets 3 potatoes, and if farmer A decides, well, I worked real hard for that, I'm going to keep a fourth potato, somebody has to stop them. And the only way to do that is at the point of a gun. And so, what you'll find is just like in the Soviet Union, if you as a farmer, and in China, it is mostly agricultural communism. So there, it's more about farms, and Russia, it's more industrial. The state comes in and arrests you or kills you for having more than what your neighbor has. And so the estimates, as Mao starts to take over, we reject this because we reject China and recognizing China as a country because of these purges. He takes over, and anybody that is you could potentially threaten the state's power, or anybody who is, not, anybody who maybe keeps a little bit more of their crop than what the state said they should have, or hoards any kind of money or supplies, they're being purged, they're being killed. 60 to 100 million people are going to be killed trying to enforce equality of outcome in this state. And, America just rejects that. We reject that, and we refuse to recognize China for essentially 30 years. It'll be Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and Realpolitik that will eventually open up China to normalized relations with the United States. So the Americans are now in a desperate situation. China fell. Remember, domino theory. If one country falls to communism, then the fear is other countries, its neighbors, will fall as well. And so the French right now are, fighting a war in Vietnam against Ho Chi Minh and the communists there. And so when we see China falls, well, Vietnam is a neighbor, and so all of a sudden now, because of domino theory, we really think that communism might spread, and we have to contain that. Remember, containment theory. And so we step up our aid to the French in Vietnam, which will lead us down the road to entering the Vietnam War. The other area of interest is also going to be Korea. Korea is a neighbor, and so there is a communist contingent in Korea, and so we're going to have to step up our involvement there if we're going to contain the spread of communism in Asia. And so you can see China falls, red flags go off. See what I did there? The China's flag is red, the color of communism. Red flags literally and figuratively go off, and containment steps up, which will lead us into our next two wars. So here's a picture of the communists entering into Beijing. Essentially, they step up. They immediately start to redistribute wealth, so taking from the people who have and giving it to the people who don't. They start to take out. They start to purge teachers, the political class. Anybody who has any kind of potential backing or power that could be a threat to the state. And they immediately start to have the government control the economy. Now, initially, that works out well for the peasants. And so anytime you see the creation of a socialist or communist state, generally speaking, the first 4 or 5 years, things go pretty decent. And that will happen in the Soviet Union, it'll happen in China, it'll happen in Cuba, and even recently, within the last decade, it happened in Venezuela. Because what you do is, all those rich people worked really hard, and they got a lot of wealth. And then when the communists and socialists take over, the government takes that wealth through force, right? Threat of jail and death. They take it, they redistribute it to the poor. And all of a sudden the lives of those people at the bottom get better. But then, because we're forcing equality, and all of a sudden the government steps in and sets wages, and so everybody is making the exact same. What we see is after that first 5 years, the economies in socialist and communist countries start to fail, and it's because they don't reward hard work and risk taking. Right? In a capitalist system, the harder you work, the smarter you are, and the more risk you're willing to take, there are potential benefits for that. And so it encourages people to work longer hours, to take some financial risks, to open a business, to be more productive, to make a better product that people want to buy. All of that increases the standard of living and makes people's lives better. But in a system where everybody gets the same no matter what, and the government dictates that, there's no benefit to working hard. There's no benefit to innovating a new product, because inventing it isn't going to make you any wealthier. No matter what you do, you're never going to have more than the person next to you. So why not just sit around and do nothing? And so production levels fall, standard of livings plummet, and economies end up failing, and that's happened over and over again. It's crazy how we haven't learned from history. I mean, it is decisive that once you start to really try and enforce these economic systems like capitalism and socialism, what happens is the standard of living just absolutely is decimated. It means that, like, you don't get newer products, you don't get new inventions, you don't get things that make life easier, you don't accumulate wealth, and the people who do get wealthy in communist and socialist systems, because you will see the political class will be the only rich people, and everybody else won't have anything, which means that the system ends up getting corrupted. So, when the communists take over China, there's no exception there. The first few years, things get better for peasants, and the peasants that survive, right? The peasants that survive. But then, after that, first few years, we see what we always see in these systems, an absolute collapse. I give you an example of Venezuela today. Venezuela was was uh, the best economy in South America, hands down, resource rich, strong, thriving middle class. When the socialists took over, they nationalized all the major industries. The government ran everything, set prices, set wages, and things were great for a few years. I mean, even American politicians were like, "Look at what's happening in Venezuela. It's so good for the people." Well, today there's riots in the street. People are eating trash, and that's what happens when you don't incentivize people to work hard, take risks, learn a skill. Right? You have ultimately a decrease in the standard of living, and then that's what's going to happen in China. All right. Next up, we're going to talk about the development of nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union. America really believes that they have a monopoly on nuclear weapons, right? We were the first to develop them with the Manhattan Project, which we talked about in a previous lecture. And it really makes America a superpower. It makes us feel safe. It makes us feel secure. But what we don't recognize is that Stalin has had a nuclear weapons program. He developed his nuclear weapons program in 1943. Now, mostly it was an intelligence gathering operation. And so most of the advancements that they made were through spying on the United States. We know that Klaus Fuchs gets caught up in a spy ring that is going to sneak out nuclear secrets and deliver them to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union will get a nuclear weapon way before America projects them to. Now, America recognizes that the Soviet Union, if they put their will to it, will eventually get one. But we think we have a ton of time, but we don't. And so, as Americans who are looking around and we talk about the fear of communism, when we see China fall to communism and we see the Soviet Union get nuclear weapons, all of a sudden we really start to be concerned that maybe communism will potentially be able to take over. So as communists took over control of China. We also receive that notice that the Soviets have nuclear weapons. They explode their first nuclear bomb. Joey 1 is the name, named after Joseph Stalin. And so, this is devastating news to the United States. We didn't expect it, and we start to have to reassess the balance of power in the world. We're not as secure as we think we are. The communists are a larger threat. I mean, two of the most populous nations in the world have now fallen to communism, and one of those countries has a nuclear weapon, and that's pretty scary for most Americans. And that's what makes this time period. You got to understand, a lot of people this time period are living in some real serious fear. I mean, people are going to be building bomb shelters. Schools are going to practice duck and cover, like hiding under a desk is going to protect you from a nuclear weapon. We'll talk more about that later. It's more psychological than physical protection. So this is a mushroom cloud from the first Soviet bomb, which is Joey 1. My little box has covered that up. And so all of a sudden now America doesn't have the lead in the arms race, which means we double down. And so we're going to start to develop more and more deadly nuclear weapons. And so by 1950, we ordered the development of the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is going to be 100 times more powerful than the bombs we used in World War II. I mean, we test it on an island in the Pacific, and it like evaporates the island, right? I mean, a mile-wide crater. I mean, that is just massive, massive destruction. And so these things are getting, crazy out of hand. And so when we get a hydrogen bomb, guess what happens next? Absolutely. The Soviet Union gets one too. Now, because we're getting more and more explosive nukes, people really start to get concerned. I mean, it's out of hand. The more nukes we have, the more likely an accident is to happen, the more likely a country is to want to use them. And so the National Security Council, the NSC, starts to recommend that, like, hey, we need to have more options than just nukes, right? After World War II, remember, one of the reasons why Truman wanted to drop the bomb on Japan was to send a signal to the Soviet Union that we don't have to have a large, expensive army to be able to protect Europe. But now that they have nukes, it can't, the threat can't just be, global annihilation through nuclear weapons. We have to have other options. And so the National Security Council is saying, hey, we need a bigger conventional military, right? Conventional military just means like average, normal soldiers, guns, tanks, airplanes. And so we'll start to develop, larger standing armies, right? And so that means we have to have these big armies around. America's just not used to that. Normally, after a war, we get rid of our military and go down to a very, not completely rid of, but we bare bones military. Now, after World War II and because of the Cold War, we're going to maintain these just absolutely gigantic militaries. And so, ultimately that helps the economy in a lot of ways, right? Because we keep all those people employed. But it's also the beginnings of America as kind of the world's police. We have this military, we have all these bases from the base destroyer deal in World War II that we talked about in a previous lecture. And so, we have the ability to intervene around the world. And so you'll start to see having the ability to intervene around the world and having the political philosophy of containment, those two things combined really lead us to being the world's police force, which today is one of those things that we're really having a domestic debate about whether or not that's a good thing. Do we need to step in all the time? Because, sometimes we do really good things and sometimes we do things that cause a lot of resentment and cause countries not to like us. And so, what's the answer there? You need a smarter man than I to figure it out. So, the idea of living under the threat of nuclear weapons is like this scary, psychologically terrifying thing. And so the people will start to kind of adjust the way they live because of the threat. Schools will start, campaigns to protect children within school, duck and cover, bird to turtle. These and the idea is, hey, this is a threat. A nuclear attack could come at any time. We don't know what the Soviets are going to do, and so they're going to put out informational videos. Now, a lot of these videos are like, if you see a bright light, don't look at it. Hide under your desk. If you're outside, get in a doorway. Or, I mean, one of these videos, and I've attached a link to the notes. I'll put them on my website so you can actually watch the videos. Some of them, if you're out at a picnic, throw the blanket over your head. Well, how much is that really going to help? And the government knows that, and that it's not really going to help unless you're on the very edge, the periphery, keep some radioactive dust from falling on you, whatever. But for the most part, it's not going to help people. The purpose of these things is not necessarily to protect people. It's just to give people a sense of security and a little bit of feeling of control over their lives. It's like putting your seatbelt on in an airplane. If you're 10,000 feet in the air and the plane is going down, why put on the seatbelt, right? They'll keep you from jostling around in case they get under control. That's good. But it's more about placating the people in the plane so they don't panic and so they can identify the body after the plane crashes. But this is psychological thing is important though, because people do have to continue to just live their lives. People have to feel comfortable on planes. So they travel for work and, do all those things. And just like people have to they can't be afraid in the 1950s to go to school or go to work because then society would shut down. And so, these programs provide that psychological comfort for society to allow, to continue on. And so most Americans are starting to recognize that our role in the world is expanding. We can't be isolationists anymore. We are an economic superpower. We are a military superpower. And if we want to protect our way of life, we're going to have to do that not only here, but abroad. And so it's going to make us more susceptible for getting involved in Korea and in Vietnam and other places. So America has philosophically changed our foreign policy from the Monroe Doctrine, which is we're minding our own business over here in the Western Hemisphere, to international interventionism. Okay, that is our lecture for today. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you again soon.